Before I begin today's story, let me thank you for being here. These memories aren't easy to share, but I know some of you will understand the weight behind them. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. But more importantly, I would love for you to tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It gives me comfort to know these words are reaching people all over the world. Today's story is not about joy. It's about something that still hurts when I close my eyes at night. It begins with a message I never thought I'd read, from the person I love most in this world, my son. The words were short, almost careless, but they shattered me. He wrote, "You won't be joining us. My wife prefers to keep it just family." I remember staring at the phone, unable to breathe. The letters blurred, as though my eyes refused to let them sink in. Just family. Wasn't I his family? I carried him, I raised him, I gave him everything I could. Yet, with one text, it felt like all those years had been erased. I sat down at the edge of my bed. The silence of the house pressed in on me. It wasn't the first time I felt excluded, but this was the first time it was spoken so plainly, so brutally. My hands shook as I read the message again, hoping I had misunderstood. But there it was, glowing coldly on the screen. A verdict, a dismissal. For a long while, I didn't cry. I didn't even move. I just sat there with the phone in my palm, remembering the years when I would have done anything to protect him from pain, never imagining that he would one day be the source of mine. That night, sleep didn't come. Instead, memories crowded in. I saw him as a little boy, running barefoot across the yard, hair sticking up in the summer heat. I remembered the nights I stayed awake by his bedside when he was sick, whispering prayers I wasn't even sure I believed in, just so he would be safe. Back then, it was just the two of us. His father wasn't there to help. I worked long hours, scrubbing floors and folding laundry for other families, so that my boy could have shoes without holes, books for school, and enough food on the table. I told myself every sacrifice was worth it, because one day he'd understand. One day he'd look at me and know how much I had given. But now, staring at that message, I wondered if he ever truly saw me at all. I tried to answer, my fingers trembling on the screen. Words formed and vanished. Should I plead with him? Should I remind him that I was the one who gave him everything? Should I demand the respect that any mother deserves? In the end, I wrote nothing. My chest ached too much to even press send. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness I had never known before. The sun streamed through the curtains, but I felt cold inside. I told myself it was just a misunderstanding, that maybe his wife was going through something, that perhaps they would invite me next time. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the beginning. It was the continuation of something that had been building for years. I began to recall the first time I felt her distance, the way his fiancée, back then, looked at me when I gave him a hug. A quick flash in her eyes, as if I had overstepped. I ignored it at the time, told myself I was imagining things. But slowly, after they married, those looks turned into words, and those words into decisions. Holidays I wasn't asked to join. Phone calls that grew shorter and shorter. Still, I held on. I baked pies for them, knitted little blankets when I thought they might have children, bought gifts I could barely afford. Each time, I told myself it was enough to show love, that sooner or later they would return it, and then came the text, that cold, final line, "You won't be joining us." I sat at my kitchen table that morning, the phone still in front of me, untouched. The coffee grew cold in my cup as I stared out the window, wondering when exactly I had lost my son. Was it when she came into his life? Was it when he moved into her house, away from the little apartment where I once rocked him to sleep? Or was it long before, hidden in moments I hadn't noticed? Neighbors passed by outside, carrying groceries, laughing, living. I wondered if they too had ever felt this hollow ache, this quiet rejection from the one person who was supposed to be your anchor in old age. I didn't tell anyone about the message. Shame clung to me like a heavy coat. I didn't want the world to know that my son had pushed me aside, that the years I spent sacrificing meant so little in his eyes. I kept it inside, carrying it like a stone in my chest, but that silence only made the hurt grow. Every memory of him as a boy felt sharper, like glass against my heart. Every quiet evening in the house felt colder, as though the walls themselves knew I had been cast out, and yet I couldn't let go, because he was still my son. And no matter how cruel the words, a mother's heart keeps beating for her child, even when it's breaking. When you've raised a child on your own, the bond feels like something unshakable, forged in fire and sleepless nights. I used to believe nothing could come between us. From the moment I held him in my arms, his tiny fist gripping my finger as if I were his whole world, I promised myself he would never feel the emptiness I once felt. Life wasn't kind to us in those years. His father disappeared before our boy even turned 2, leaving behind little more than a stack of unpaid bills and a silence that echoed through our apartment. I remember standing in the kitchen, holding a letter from the landlord in one hand and my son on my hip, wondering how I was going to pay rent. But then he smiled at me, a gummy, innocent smile, and I thought, for you, I can survive anything. And I did. I worked jobs no one else wanted, cleaning houses, folding laundry in the back of a hotel, standing on aching feet behind counters where no one bothered to learn my name. Each coin, each paycheck went to keeping us afloat. Shoes that fit his growing feet, school supplies so he wouldn't feel left out, second-hand jackets I mended until they looked new. I went without so he never had to. He was such a bright child, always curious, always asking questions that made me laugh even when I wanted to cry. I remember one winter when the heater broke in our little apartment. I wrapped him in 3 blankets, our breaths fogging in the cold air, and he asked, "Mama, is this what penguins feel like?" I told him yes, and we waddled around the room together, shivering and laughing until our cheeks hurt. In that moment, I thought no matter how poor we were, we had joy, and that was enough. As he grew older, he started to understand the sacrifices. On Mother's Day, when he was 10, he made me a card from scraps of cardboard he found behind the school. In shaky handwriting, he wrote, "Thank you for being my mum and my dad." I still have it, tucked away in a drawer. Every time I look at it, I remember the boy who once saw me as his whole family. But then came the day he met her. At first I was glad. I wanted him to find love, to build a life better than the one I could give him alone. I welcomed her with open arms, cooked meals when they visited, told her stories of when he was a child. But there was a distance in her smile, a chill in her eyes whenever I touched his arm or told him I loved him. I brushed it off as nerves, thinking time would soften her edges. I still remember the first holiday after their engagement. I had spent the week baking pies and cooking his favorite dishes, the ones I made every year when he was little. I pictured us all around the table, laughter filling the house. But just a day before, he called to say they wouldn't be coming. "She wants to spend it with her family this year," he said casually, as though it was nothing. I tried to understand. One holiday wouldn't break us, but then it became 2, then 3. Each time I told myself not to complain, not to burden him with guilt. After all, he deserved happiness. And if being with her family made him happy, who was I to stand in the way? Still, there were moments when the mask slipped. One evening, I stopped by their new apartment with a basket of food, homemade bread, jars of jam I'd saved up to make. She opened the door, her expression tightening the moment she saw me. "You didn't call," she said flatly. I stammered, explaining I just wanted to surprise them. She took the basket without inviting me inside. Later, my son called. His voice was stiff, formal. "Mum, maybe you should let us know before coming over. It's just easier that way." I hung up the phone and sat in the dark for a long time, the bread still warm in my hands, tears blurring the kitchen walls. From then on, I noticed the changes more clearly. His phone calls grew shorter, the laughter in his voice faded, and though he still said, "Love you, Mum," at the end, it sounded more like habit than truth. I told myself it was part of life. Children grow up, they build new families, and mothers must step back. But the way it happened, the sharpness in her tone, the silence in his eyes, made me feel less like a mother and more like an unwelcome guest in my own son's story. And yet, I kept trying. I sent birthday cards, left voicemails, even knitted a blanket when I thought they might start a family. But every attempt was met with silence, or worse, polite indifference. Until the day came when my hope crumbled with a single text. "You won't be joining us." That was when I began to understand. This wasn't just about holidays or visits. This was about erasure. Little by little, piece by piece, I was being written out of his life. But the cruelest part was realizing I had no one else. He was all I had, and now even he was slipping away. The first years of their marriage were like watching a door slowly close in front of me. At first, it was just a small gap, wide enough for me to still peek inside, to still believe I was part of their world. But with every season, every holiday, that door creaked closer to being shut. When they first moved into their house, I offered to help. I brought cleaning supplies, even packed sandwiches, so we wouldn't have to stop for meals. My son thanked me politely, but his wife's smile was tight, the kind you give a stranger at the grocery store. By the end of the day, she had taken over every room, directing where the furniture went, deciding what stayed and what didn't. I noticed that the blanket I had knitted for their couch, one I made in his college years to keep him warm during long nights of studying, was folded away into a closet. Not thrown out, but hidden, as if my presence didn't belong in their new life. I told myself it was silly to feel hurt. After all, it was just a blanket. But that small act whispered a truth I didn't want to face. The pieces of me that once filled his world were being tucked away, one by one. The phone calls began to change too. Where once he called me every evening just to say goodnight, now it was once a week, then once every 2. The conversations grew shorter. "Work is busy. She's tired. We'll call you soon." Soon became later, and later became silence. I sat by the phone sometimes, convincing myself that maybe the line was broken, maybe I had missed the ring. But deep down, I knew the silence was deliberate. I tried to visit, but visits became awkward. When I sat at their dinner table, she rarely looked me in the eye. Conversation felt strained, like we were strangers sharing the same air. My son would smile nervously, cracking jokes that fell flat, glancing at her as if for permission before speaking. The home that was supposed to be filled with warmth and family felt like a place where I was tolerated, not welcomed. One night, after a particularly quiet dinner, I stayed behind while my son walked me to the door. I couldn't hold back anymore. My voice shook as I asked, "Have I done something wrong? Have I offended her?" He hesitated, his eyes darting away. "No, Mom. It's not like that. She likes things a certain way." "A certain way," I repeated softly. The words cut deeper than I expected. A certain way that didn't include me. I wanted to scream, to shake him, and remind him of every sacrifice, every night I spent working while he slept safe in his bed. But instead, I nodded and whispered, "I understand." Because what else could I say? He was no longer the boy I raised. He was a husband now, and his loyalty belonged elsewhere. Still, I kept trying. I baked bread and left it on their porch with a note. I sent texts asking how they were. Sometimes he responded with a smiley face, sometimes not at all. Each unanswered message was like a stone placed on my chest, making it harder to breathe. The loneliness grew heavier in my own home. The walls seemed to echo with the sound of his laughter from years ago, but now there was only silence. I started talking to myself just to hear a voice. I watered plants I didn't care about, walked circles around the block, anything to fill the hours that once belonged to him. But even then, hope lingered. I told myself maybe when they had children, things would change. Maybe she would need me then. Maybe I would finally be welcomed back into his life, not as an intruder, but as a grandmother. So I knitted, little sweaters, tiny socks. I tucked them into a drawer, waiting for the day I'd hand them over with trembling, excited hands. But that day never came. Months turned into years, and still there was no word, no announcement, only silence. Then one evening, my phone rang. My heart leapt when I saw his name on the screen. I answered quickly, trying to hide the desperation in my voice. "Hello, sweetheart," but his tone was flat. "Mum, listen. She doesn't want surprise visits anymore. It makes her uncomfortable." The words burned like fire. I wanted to argue, to ask why kindness made her uncomfortable, why a mother bringing food or love was unwelcome. But my throat closed. I only managed a quiet, "I see." That night I sat in the dark kitchen, staring at the half-finished baby sweater in my lap. The yarn dangled uselessly from the needles, as if mocking the hope I had poured into it. For the first time, I wondered if maybe there would never be a place for me in their family at all. And yet, I still held on to the belief that things would get better. I told myself love couldn't disappear so easily, not when I had carried him in my arms, wiped his tears, celebrated every small victory of his childhood. Surely, one day, he would remember. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered otherwise. A voice I tried to silence every night before bed. It told me that the son I once knew was slipping further away, and that no amount of love could pull him back. It was just before Christmas when I decided to try one last time. The streets were strung with lights, children ran bundled in scarves, and every shop window seemed to glow with warmth. I walked past them with a heavy bag in my hands. Inside were small gifts I had saved up for, a scarf for my son, one I had knitted through long, lonely evenings, a cookbook for her, because she had once mentioned a recipe she wanted to try, and a delicate ornament for their tree, carved with the word family. I imagined their faces when they saw the gifts. Maybe her heart would soften, maybe his eyes would light up as they once did. I told myself love always finds a way back. When I reached their doorstep, snowflakes clung to my coat. I knocked, my breath fogging in the cold. Inside, I heard laughter, clinking glasses, voices carrying the warmth of celebration. My heart swelled. Maybe this time, maybe tonight. The door opened a crack. She stood there, her smile thin and sharp. Behind her, I glimpsed the glow of the Christmas tree, the sound of voices I didn't recognize. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone flat. I brought gifts," I stammered, holding up the bag. "Just a few small things. I thought—" Her eyes flickered behind her, toward the living room. Then she stepped outside, pulling the door nearly shut behind her. "This isn't a good time," she said. I froze, the cold biting through my gloves. "But it's Christmas." Her voice lowered, sharper. "We've talked about this. You can't just show up. He's busy with our guests." "I'm his mother," I whispered, my throat aching. I only wanted— The door closed fully, cutting me off. I stood there, bag in hand, the muffled laughter spilling through the walls. For a moment, I thought maybe she would come back, that the door would open again and my son would appear, pulling me inside like he used to when he was a boy. But the silence stretched on. The door stayed shut. I set the bag gently on the doorstep. My fingers lingered on the scarf I had knitted, the one meant to keep him warm. Then I turned and walked away, the snow crunching beneath my shoes. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though I were dragging the weight of every sacrifice I had ever made. The streets sparkled with lights, but to me, they felt like shadows. Families hurried past, their arms filled with gifts, their voices full of cheer. I lowered my head, clutching my coat tighter, afraid the strangers might see the tears that blurred my vision. When I returned home, the silence greeted me like an old friend. I set a single candle on the table, lit it, and watched the flame tremble. The gifts I had left on their doorstep haunted me. Would they open them? Would they be thrown aside? Or would they be hidden in a closet, like the blanket I once made, forgotten and unwanted? That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, staring at the falling snow, wondering when exactly I had become a stranger to my own child. The memories of his childhood came rushing back, his laughter, his small hand in mine, the promises I made to always be there for him. But now, it was as if those years had never happened, erased by someone else's will. I wanted to call him, to beg him to explain, but fear held me back. Fear that he wouldn't answer, or worse, that he would, and his voice would carry the same coldness as hers. Instead, I whispered into the dark, as if he could hear me across the miles. I still love you, I always will. My words vanished into the silence, unheard, unreturned, and as the candle burned low, I realized something I had never dared to admit before. It wasn't just that I had been excluded from a dinner, or a holiday, or even a family. It was something far deeper, far crueler. That was the night I realized. I was no longer his mother in their eyes.